For 30 years, the neighbors called it the biggest mistake on the peninsula. A man had bought a bare, wind-scoured block of hillside in New Zealand, and then he did something no farmer in the district could understand. He let the weed win. A spiny, aggressive, half-hated plant was creeping up the slopes, choking the pasture, turning the green farmland into a wall of yellow thorns. Everyone around him spent their weekends cutting it, spraying it, burning it back. He did nothing. He just watched it spread. They said he was a fool. They said he was throwing the land away. But walk across those same hills today, and you will not find a wasteland. You will find one of the most remarkable forests in the country. Tall, wet, alive, full of birds that had vanished from the region for 100 years. And the strangest part of the whole story? The forest didn't grow despite the weed. It grew because of it. To understand how that happened, you have to go back, long before the weed, long before the forest. This is Banks Peninsula, a knuckle of ancient volcanoes on the east coast of New Zealand's South Island. And once, almost all of it was covered in forest. Dense, dripping, temperate rainforest, giant podocarp trees, a canopy so thick that the ground beneath barely saw the sun. Then people arrived. First came fire and clearing by early settlers. Then came the axe and the saw on an industrial scale. Over a few short decades in the 1800s, the peninsula was stripped almost bare. The great trees were felled for timber. The rest was burned to make way for grass, for sheep, for cattle. By the 20th century, more than 99% of the original forest was gone. What was left was farmland, but farmland on steep, unforgiving volcanic slopes. And without the trees to hold it, the land began to bleed. The soil washed off the hills in the rain. The wind scoured the ridges. Springs that once ran clear began to dry up in summer. On the higher, harder blocks, the ones too steep and too cold to farm well, the land just slowly wore out. And this is where our story really begins. On one of those worn-out blocks, above the small harbor town of Akaroa, sat a hillside nobody wanted. Marginal farmland, poor returns, cold, wet, and slipping downhill a little more every year. To most people, it looked like the end of something. To one botanist, it looked like a question. In 1987, a native forest trust bought that block of land, about 109 hectares of tired hill country, and handed it to a man named Hugh Wilson. Wilson was a botanist. He knew the plants of New Zealand as well as almost anyone alive. He didn't own a car. He rode a bicycle for decades. He kept his weather records by hand. And he had one clear, almost stubborn idea about what this land was supposed to become. He wanted the forest back. Not a plantation, not neat rows of planted trees. He wanted the original forest, the wild, self-organizing rainforest that had covered these hills before the fires. And here was the problem everyone expected him to solve. The hills were covered in a weed. The weed was gorse. Brought to New Zealand from Europe, planted innocently as a hedge, it had escaped across the country and become one of the most hated invasive plants in the nation. It's spiny. It's flammable. It grows in thick, impenetrable thickets. It takes over pasture and refuses to leave. Farmers had spent generations and fortunes fighting it, cutting it, spraying it, burning it. The law itself treated gorse as an enemy to be controlled. So everyone assumed Wilson's first job would be to clear it. He refused. He looked at that ugly wall of thorns spreading across his hills, and he saw something no one else was willing to see. He saw a nursery. When Wilson explained his plan, the reaction was close to disbelief. He was going to let the gorse grow. On purpose. He was going to stand back and allow the most despised weed in the country to take over the very land he'd been trusted to restore. One local farmer summed up what a lot of people were thinking. He called the whole project the work of fools and dreamers. And you can understand why. Every instinct in that farming community said the same thing. A weed is a weed. You fight weeds. You don't invite them. Letting gorse run wild wasn't restoration. It was surrender. Even the rules were against him. Regional regulations still required gorse to be cleared along the boundaries to stop it spreading onto neighbors' farms. So Wilson spent real effort keeping the edges in check, cutting the gorse back where the law demanded, keeping the peace with the people around him. But on the inside of the reserve, up on those cold, damaged slopes, he held his nerve. He let it grow. For years, that's all there was to see. A man with a bicycle, a hillside full of thorns, and a district quietly convinced he was wasting everyone's time. And then, slowly, quietly, from underneath, something began to change. If you had crawled in under the gorse in those early years, past the spines, into the shade beneath, you would have found the first clue: seedlings, tiny native seedlings, trees that hadn't grown wild on these hills in living memory, pushing up out of the soil in the dim light beneath the weed. At first it was easy to miss, a few here, a few there, but the longer Wilson looked, the more he found: native broadleaf trees, small-leaved shrubs, the pioneers of the old forest, germinating not in the open pasture, not on the bare slopes, but inside the thicket everyone wanted gone. And that raised a strange question. Why there? Why would delicate native seedlings choose the harshest-looking, thorniest, most tangled part of the whole landscape? The open pasture next door was empty of them. The sprayed ground was empty of them. But under the gorse, the enemy, the forest was quietly being born. The first part of the answer was shelter. A newly germinated native seedling out in the open on a Banks Peninsula hillside faces a brutal life: scouring wind, hard frosts, blazing summer sun that dries the soil to dust, hungry stock and browsing pests looking for something soft to eat. Almost nothing survives that. But inside a gorse thicket, the world is completely different. The dense, spiny mass breaks the wind. It traps a layer of still, humid air. It shades the ground and holds the moisture. It even guards against frost. And those same vicious spines that make gorse so hated? They keep the browsers out. A seedling that would die in the open can survive, even thrive, in that sheltered, protected space. The weed wasn't smothering the forest. It was babysitting it. But shelter was only half of it. To understand the rest, you have to look underground. Gorse belongs to the legume family, the same broad family as peas and clover, and like many legumes, it does something remarkable in the soil. In little nodules on its roots, it partners with bacteria that pull nitrogen straight out of the air and lock it into the ground. Nitrogen is one of the things plants need most, and one of the things this tired, worn-out farmland was short of. So while everyone was looking at the ugly yellow weed above the ground, the gorse was quietly fertilizing the soil beneath it, rebuilding the very fertility that a century of farming and erosion had stripped away. Year after year, the gorse dropped its old spines and stems. That litter rotted down into the ground, feeding a new layer of living soil, the kind of moist, rich, biologically alive earth that a forest needs, and that bare pasture simply doesn't have. The weed was preparing the ground for its own replacement, and that's the part almost no one saw coming. Because here is the crucial thing about gorse. It is a plant that loves light. It's a pioneer, fast, aggressive, brilliant at colonizing open ground. But it cannot grow in shade. The native trees growing up underneath it can. So as those sheltered native seedlings kept climbing, feeding on the nitrogen-rich soil, protected from the wind and the frost and the browsers, they eventually did something the gorse could not stop. They grew taller than it. The natives pushed up through the yellow thicket and spread their leaves above it. And as their canopy closed, they cast the whole thicket into shade. For gorse, a plant that needs full sun, shade is a death sentence. Slowly, beneath the rising forest, the gorse began to weaken. Then it began to die. The weed that had invaded the hills had, in effect, built a cradle for the forest, fertilized the ground, sheltered the seedlings until they were strong, and then, as the trees rose over it, quietly stepped aside and disappeared. It wasn't a war between the weed and the forest at all. It was a handover. Once that handover started, it didn't stop. The first wave of hardy native pioneers created shade and shelter of their own, and under them, a second wave of forest trees began to grow. Slower, taller, longer-lived species. The kind that build a true, mature rainforest. The reserve was named Hinawai, and decade by decade, it transformed. The birds came back. Native pigeons, bellbirds, fantails, tui, species that spread the seeds of forest trees in their droppings, carrying the forest further and faster than any person could plant it. The more forest there was, the more birds arrived, and the more birds arrived, the more forest they seeded. The system began to build itself, and something changed in the water too. As the forest returned and the deep, spongy soil rebuilt, the hills began to hold moisture again. Springs that had run dry in the old farming days started to flow through the summer. The forest wasn't just growing, it was healing the water cycle underneath it. From 109 hectares of tired hillside, Hinawai grew. Land was added. Neighbors, some of them once skeptics, came around. Today, the reserve stretches across roughly 1,700 hectares of regenerating native forest, one of the largest privately protected restoration areas of its kind in the country. And most of it was never planted by human hands at all. It was allowed. Now, it would be easy to end there, with a tidy miracle. But the real story is more careful than that, and Wilson himself was always careful about it. Letting gorse turn into forest is not a magic switch you can flick on any hillside. It worked at Hinawai because the conditions were right. The climate was wet enough. There were still remnants of native forest nearby, surviving in gullies and steep corners, to supply the seeds, and there were birds left to carry those seeds into the thickets. Take away the seed source, and gorse left alone doesn't become forest. It just becomes more gorse. And it took time. The kind of time that tests a person, not one season, not 5. Decades of holding the line while the district doubted you, of trusting a process you couldn't rush, of watching a hillside that looked, for years, like failure. Wilson also never pretended the weed was harmless. Gorse is genuinely invasive. It's a real problem in the wrong place. What he understood, and what almost everyone else missed, was that in the right place, with a forest waiting in the wings, that same aggressive weed could be turned from an enemy into a tool. He didn't defeat nature. He didn't force the land. He read what the ecosystem was already trying to do, and he got out of its way. So who was the fool? The man who spent 30 years being laughed at for letting a weed grow and grew a forest that will outlive everyone who mocked him? Or the certainty that said a damaged landscape only recovers when we fight it, clear it, and control it? What happened on those hills points to something we get wrong again and again. We tend to see nature as a set of problems to be solved. A weed to kill, a slope to manage, a system to command, and sometimes that's exactly what's needed, but sometimes the land already knows the way back. Sometimes the very thing we're taught to destroy is the scaffolding a forest needs to rebuild itself. And the hardest, wisest thing a person can do is not to intervene harder, but to watch closely, understand what's really happening, and have the patience to let it unfold. A worn-out hillside, a hated weed, one stubborn man who refused to fight the wrong battle, and out of all of it, quietly, from underneath, over 30 patient years, a forest returned to hills that everyone else had given up on. Nature didn't need to be forced, it just needed to be trusted.